Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Conversations That Matter. I'm your host, Alex Newman, senior editor at the New American Magazine, and we have a very special guest for you today. We always have very special guests for you. If they weren't very special, we wouldn't bring them on. But today we have Dan Smithwick. He's the founder and chief of the Nehemiah Institute, a great organization that studies the worldview of Christians. They've been doing it for decades. They've been doing a very good job, in my opinion. I just so happen to serve on the advisory board of the organization because I think it's great and because I think Dan is doing very important work. And I wanted to just bring him on today and share with you some of his findings. Dan, thank you so much for coming on the program. And before we even get into the trends that you've been seeing, for the folks out there who aren't familiar with a biblical worldview, what exactly do you mean by a biblical worldview, and how do you measure that?
Well, thank you. And thanks for having me on, Alex. I appreciate this very much. At times I hear people say, gee, I probably should get a worldview that works right. And it's like it's a noun, it's something you go get. Well, all of us have a worldview, rightly understood, because worldview just means when we look out at the world and we make judgments about what's right, what's wrong, good, bad, we're using some presuppositions to make that call, and that defines our worldview. What is it within us that we've developed our thoughts from our education, our upbringing, our environment that causes us to think certain ways? And the essence of that is worldview. There's lots of different worldview isms. Biblical theism is what Christianity holds as a proper way of looking at the world, God, and man, and so forth. And so that's how we got into the worldview business. I did this a lot. I created Nehemiah Institute because of reading Francis Schaeffer in the 60s and 70s. He was the first one that I saw using the term worldview. And there were some things going on with me back then that caused me to wonder about America's worldview, why we were jettisoning the worldview that we had been birthed with, a Judeo-Christian worldview. And that led to the development of this assessment tool that Christian schools now use, and homeschoolers and church youth groups, to discern how much of a biblical worldview are we giving our people. That's what I'm kind of known for around the country, this tool called the Peers Test.
And so explain to us, Dan, how this peer test works. Where'd you get the questions from? I mean, how do you measure someone's biblical worldview? And would this be like, could somebody read the Bible and say, well, that's not how I understand that, or something like that? Or is this pretty objective?
It's very objective. It would be hard to just say from a casual reading of scriptures anyway, that you would develop a mature Christian worldview. When I had the idea to do this, I read a lot of resource material of both biblical scholars that were known for their position on a Christian view of whatever subject. These were professors at Christian universities, authors of good materials, heads of schools in different cases. But I also read foundational documents of the other side, meaning the humanist and the socialist. So I read things like the Communist Manifesto, Secular Humanist Manifesto, and looking for basic presuppositions. Why do they believe what they believe? I crafted a number of statements out of both of those sources that were capturing the essence or the basic presuppositions of why they believed what they believe. And I was just doing that for a couple of years, and eventually had about 100 statements that seemed to identify views on economics and on religion and on education. And I began categorizing these 100 statements, and one day out popped 5 categories, which I arranged them in a particular way to form an acronym: politics, economics, education, religion, and social issues. And Peers was born that day.
So give us an example of 1 or 2, maybe even 3 questions that would show clearly either you think biblically or you don't.
Sure. So the one that's most frequently missed by students, even from Christian communities, is that education is a right, and this right must be protected and enforced by civil governments.
Mm-hmm. So that's not biblical, huh?
That's not biblical at all. And I always say, Alex, that when our education system gets our kids to think that way, they pretty much have them. If they think that education is a right and that government is there to ensure that right, they've got them on a number of other issues.
Mm-hmm.
We
So,
have,
so what is education then? If it's not a right that is to be enforced by civil government, what does the Bible teach on that?
the Bible says, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. So it's a responsibility. It's not a right.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way we describe education. Is ignorance is not, a pass. We don't get a pass standing before God and saying, well, nobody taught me and I didn't know, so therefore you can't condemn me. You don't find that in the scriptures. Salvation by ignorance is a myth.
Yeah, very good. Dan, what kind of trends have you noticed? You've been doing this for, what is it, 30 some years?
32 years. And
32 years. So what have you noticed in giving this test out to churches and Christian schools all across the country? Have there been any trends or patterns?
Surely has. When we began this in the early 80s, mid 80s, Christian schools, youth groups were testing in what we classified as a moderate Christian worldview, kind of a weak Christian worldview, maybe 1 foot in the kingdom, 1 foot in the world, I kind of say. And I wasn't surprised about that because of the drift that America was already in by that time. But over the next several years, I just began to notice a continual downgrade or lower results from most youth. These are high school students from Christian homes, many cases involved with their churches, and the results getting lower and lower, with the exception of a few schools. I've discovered 2 particular Christian school associations that we now identify as biblical worldview schools. That's the classical Christian schools and another group called principle approach schools. These schools go to great efforts to really make biblical worldview work in a sense of understanding of it, curriculum materials, teacher training, even parent training. And that makes a difference. That makes all the difference in the world. So those schools are gradually improving. The other Christian schools and certainly youth groups keep going very secular, well on their way to what we would classify as a basic socialist worldview.
Wow. Where do homeschoolers fit in here?
They generally rank in between the traditional Christian schools, as we call them, and the better Christian schools, the worldview schools. The homeschool trend has been the highest percentage gain over the last 4 or 5 years. So we're encouraged by what we see amongst homeschool families. But sometimes parents are not familiar with resources that are there for understanding a secular or socialist worldview. They don't have those ready at hand. And so that's probably a weakness that could be resulting in better scores.
So what kind of resources do you recommend, Dan? Say somebody's watching this, maybe it's a homeschool dad, a homeschool mom, and they're thinking, whoa, I wonder where my child falls on this and how do we do better? What would you recommend for people who are interested in trying to instill a biblical worldview, first in themselves and then in their children?
Sure. Well, certainly taking the Peers test first, just get this basic read of what kind of items are we on the wrong side of. And then
I took it, full disclosure, and I got an A. Woohoo! Proud of myself. Oh wait, pride goes before the fall. I better not be proud. But no, I did get an A, and I was very pleased with that.
Right, of course. Some years ago, we always get asked that question. When we did this Peers testing for the first 10 years with Christian schools, they would ask that question. What do you recommend we do? Because, the results weren't so good. We would point them to Summit Ministries. That is still a good source. They're a wonderful resource called Understanding the Times is a really good read on worldview. But we developed our own worldview primer called Pillars, which is tightly tied to the Peers test. So we took the 5 Peers categories, wrote a chapter on each of them, and laid out basic biblical principles, chapter and verse, about politics, meaning government, economics, education. We market that as a high school product. I have taught the course myself to adult study groups in churches. Every time I teach it, I find adults saying, boy, we need this as much as our kids need it. So that's what I have to recommend most is the Pillars course, which is on our website, NehemiahInstitute.com.
Fantastic, Dan. And overall, are you optimistic? I mean, I've looked at your findings, and they're to me, they're troubling. I've seen George Barna's findings, and I know they're not quite as in depth as yours, but if I'm not mistaken, it shows like 6% of adults have a Christian biblical worldview, like 2% of young parents have a biblical worldview? Are you concerned about the direction we're heading, or are you optimistic, or neither?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I have two answers to that, Alex. I'm optimistic in the sense that I'm a post-mill person. So in time, God's going to get our attention and is going to righten the ship. That could be decades away, because we've been falling into this problem for decades, really since Horseman and John Dewey convinced America to give education to the government. Mm-hmm. So this has been a long, slow burn. So I'm very pessimistic about the next several years of what's going to happen, because we've elected leaders who do not have a biblical worldview. We have teachers, even in Christian institutions, that have not been trained in biblical worldview. They have this secular philosophy of life. So I think we're heading into some dark days for quite a long time. And like Israel often did, when they went wayward, it cost them time, resources. And eventually they would cry out to God, where did we go wrong? And that's going to happen to America. And when we are on our knees and asking, where did we go wrong? We feel like we can be of help in saying, here's where we went wrong. You know what the number one issue, Alex, is that I see that has taken us in the wrong way within Christian circles is view of government. What is the responsibility of government? And we have assigned almost everything into the realm of government. Any problem that comes up, people say, what's the government going to do about it? Yeah. In most cases, the government shouldn't do anything about it. Mm-hmm. But because that's the issue of authority, who's in charge here? When we mess that up, it's Katie bar the door.
Yeah. Well, Dan, I really appreciate you spending some time with us. Before we let you go, what's the best way to get to your organization? How do people find you online? Are you on any social media? And if somebody wanted to take the peers test, how would they do that?
Our site is nehemiahinstitute.com. If someone from this viewing would like to take the peers test, I would like them to call me at this number and we'll give them a free session. How about that?
Fantastic.
800-948-3101. 800-948-3101. Just say, hey, I heard you on Alex Newman show, and I'll take you up on your offer for a free peers test. We'll keep that open for a week. How about that?
Fantastic. Well, Dan, thank you so much for all the work that you've done. Thank you for coming on the show and sharing your insights with us. And hopefully, many more people will be getting a biblical worldview in the years ahead. And thanks again, Dan. We really appreciate it.
Thanks. God bless, Alex.
God bless you too. All right, folks, that was Dan Smithwick, head of the Nehemiah Institute. Go check them out, nehemiahinstitute.com. They've got all kinds of fantastic resources. I'm Alex Newman. This is Conversations That Matter for the New American Magazine. Thanks for tuning in, folks. We'll catch you soon. Until then, God bless you all.